One of the nice features of our oscilloscope is that it has a measure function. Normally, you measure things on the oscilloscope by counting divisions. For example, this is 500 millivolts vertical division. So this waveform is 500, 1, 1.5, 2, a little bit over 2 volts peak to peak. But if we select the measure function, that's this button right here, the oscilloscope will display 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 measurements. And we can customize each of those. For example, if we select the top measurement, we select which channel we're measuring. We can select any of the 4 channels. And the type of measurement. For example, we can select either time or voltage measurements just by cycling through. We start with none. That would turn off all measurement. We can select frequency. In this case, we've got 1,000 hertz, 1 kilohertz wave. The period, that's the inverse of frequency. In that case, it's about 1 millisecond. The mean value, that's the average value of the voltage here. Since there's no DC offset, the average value is close to 0. If I add, say, 1 volt of DC offset, 2 volts of DC offset, it's telling us that there's a DC offset added. I'm going to take the DC offset out. So the mean is the average DC. We can get the peak-to-peak value. In this case, it's a little over 2. We already did that manually. We can do an RMS value. We either will or have talked about what RMS means in class. What the minimum value of the signal is, the maximum value of the signal is. Rise time is how quickly the signal goes from a low level to a high level. That's usually used on waveforms like square waves. So this waveform is going from low to high in 1.6 microseconds. Fall time. Oops. Let's go back to channel 1. How long it's positive, how long it's negative. The ones we're going to use most often are frequency, although the scope always displays the frequency of channel 1 down here. Peak to peak is very useful. And then when we go back, this will show peak to peak. We can similarly set each of these to a different measurement. You're going to want to use this feature to measure frequency and amplitude in the various labs. There's also a cursor feature. Let's go take a look at that. So we have a button called cursor. When we press that, we get our cursor menu. Right now the cursors are off. We can turn the cursor to either voltage, which means a set of horizontal cursors that measure the difference between 2 positions vertically on the screen, a time cursor, which measures the distance horizontally between 2 vertical cursors. So let's go back first to our voltage cursor. Our cursors, when they're on, are controlled by the channel 1 and channel 2 position controls. And we know that because of the light that lights up to say we're in cursor mode. So if I move cursor A, that's channel 1, cursor B. So if I want to measure the amplitude of this, I put one cursor on the bottom-most portion, one on the top. Let's go to a sine wave because that's a little harder to measure. So I can adjust this so it's right at the tip of the top, right at the tip of the bottom, and I can read that that's 1.02 volts. Now, that particular measurement's already built into the scope. We had set for peak to peak, but if we wanted to measure to some other place on the waveform, like say from the 0 point to the peak, we would know that that was 102 volts. So we can do a voltage cursor. We can also do a time cursor. If we want to know how long it takes from this peak to this peak, well, it's 1 millisecond. We expect that because it's 1 kilohertz. Notice we're also getting the absolute position of the cursors. So, and that absolute position is from the trigger. So our trigger is this white line here. That's the point at which our waveform starts. So cursor 1 is right at the trigger point, that's 0. As I move it left, it's before the cursor, so I can measure before the trigger point. I can measure how many microseconds before the trigger point. My second cursor I've set right at the trigger, so cursor 2 is at 0 delay from trigger. As I go to the right, it tells us how long after the trigger. So between the measure button and the cursor button, we can measure a lot of different parts of our circuit. In general, I would turn my cursors off when I no longer need them.
You do that by going back into the cursor menu and then selecting cursor off.